The night of December 1958, inside the most expensive ballroom in Las Vegas, the most powerful mob boss west of Chicago raised his hand and struck the greatest singer who ever lived. He did it slowly, deliberately, like a man who had never once been told no, like a man who had spent so many years watching other men step aside that he had forgotten, somewhere deep in the architecture of who he was, that the world contained people who would not. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew yet, was that Dean Martin was standing 12 feet away with glass in his hand, and 40 years of watching powerful men mistake silence for permission. And Dean Martin never forgot a thing. Not a single thing. The Venetian Ballroom of the Sands Hotel did not tolerate imperfection. Every chandelier had been polished that afternoon by a man whose only job, on evenings like this one, was chandeliers. The candles on each table burned at precisely the same height, replaced the moment they dipped below an inch by staff who moved through the room like shadows, present only in function and never in presence. The tablecloths were Italian linen, ironed twice. The champagne came from a cellar that the hotel's general manager referred to, without irony or embarrassment, as the vault. Invitations to this particular evening, a private benefit dinner for the Nevada Gaming Commission's annual charity fund, had been sent by hand on cardstock that cost more per sheet than most Americans spent on groceries in a week. Every detail of the room communicated the same single idea, that money, in sufficient quantity and sufficiently well deployed, could approximate beauty, could approximate, in fact, almost anything. 230 people sat inside that room. Every one of them understood, without being told, that they were there because someone powerful had decided they deserved to be. Politicians and their wives, entertainers and their managers, casino owners and the people whose money the casino owners manage, commissioners and their attorneys, and scattered throughout like dark matter holding it all together, the men whose specific category of power required no title and left no paper trail. They ate the food and drank the champagne and talked to each other with a calibrated warmth of people who had learned long ago that in rooms like this one, every conversation was also a negotiation, and every smile was also a measurement. Raymond Caruso understood this better than anyone in the room. He had written the curriculum. He sat at table 3, never the head table, because Raymond Caruso had spent 30 years making sure he was never photographed at a head table, never identified in a caption, never positioned in an image that could later be introduced as evidence of anything, in a suit that his tailor in Naples had finished 2 weeks earlier and airmailed his office on Fremont Street, wrapped in tissue paper like something sacred. He was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders in a way that had once been muscle and was now simply mass, the body of a man who had stopped needing to prove things physically sometime in his late 30s and had since allowed himself to become something more architectural than athletic. His face had the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that expressions cost you, that a raised eyebrow could be read, that a smile could be cataloged. He had trained his face the way other men trained their bodies, and the result was a kind of blankness that people who didn't know him often mistook for stupidity, which was the most useful mistake they ever made. His hands rested on the tablecloth with the patience of something geological. Beside him sat his associate Sal, a lean younger man with quick eyes and the nervous energy of someone who had been in proximity to power long enough to understand its requirements, but not long enough to wear them comfortably. Sal laughed at everything Caruso said approximately 3 seconds after he said it, which was a laugh of a man calculating rather than feeling. Across the table sat 2 men from the commission whose names do not matter to this story, except as furniture. They were the kind of men who mattered enormously in certain rooms and not at all in others, and this evening they would discover, with some discomfort, which kind of room this was. What mattered, what Caruso had arranged his entire evening around, what had caused him to accept an invitation he might otherwise have declined, what had made him sit through 2 hours of dinner conversation with men he found fundamentally boring, was Ella Fitzgerald. She had been booked 3 months prior. Her fee for a single evening performance was a number that made the hotel's general manager sit down when he heard it and then stand back up and agree to it, because there were certain things that the Sands could not afford not to have, and Ella Fitzgerald in 1958 was one of them. She was not a performer you bargained with. She was not a name you used to fill a program. She was, as the music critic for the Las Vegas Sun had written that very week in a review that had been cut out and pinned to bulletin board in the hotel's entertainment office, The last proof that God occasionally does his best work in a recording studio. The evening's program listed her for 45 minutes. Everyone in the room knew she would go longer. Ella always went longer, because Ella Fitzgerald was constitutionally incapable of giving a room less than it needed, and what rooms needed from Ella Fitzgerald was always more than anyone had scheduled. She walked out to microphone at 9:17. The room went quiet the way rooms only go quiet for two things: royalty and catastrophe, and she was that night both and neither, which is to say she was something that didn't fit into existing categories and never had. She was 31 years old, and she wore the kind of authority that most performers spend entire careers reaching for and arrive at if they're lucky in their 50s. She was wearing a blue dress the color of deep water, just before dawn, cut simply, sequin along the bodice, adorned with nothing additional because nothing additional was needed or would have been appropriate. Around her neck, a single strand of pearls. On her wrist, a gold bracelet that caught the chandelier light when she moved. Her hair swept up, her posture the posture of a woman who had learned, in rooms that had tried very hard to diminish her, that the spine was political. She adjusted the vintage microphone once. A small, precise gesture, looked out the room with those dark, measuring eyes that seemed to be doing several kinds of calculations simultaneously, and without any introduction, without any greeting, without giving the room any warning at all, she opened her mouth. The first note she sang landed in the chest of every person present like a hand reaching in and squeezing, gently but with unmistakable authority. Right at the center of something they had forgotten was there. She sang The Man I Love first, and she sang it the way she sang everything, not as performance but as statement. Each note placed with the precision of someone who understands that music is not decoration but argument. Then she moved into Angel Eyes, which she took slower than the recorded version, slower than anyone expected, pulling the melody apart to show what was inside it, and the room held its breath for the duration. Then something from her Cole Porter songbook that hadn't been released yet. And the silence that followed each phrase was not the silence of an audience waiting for the next thing, but the silence of people temporarily unable to move. Dean Martin watched from the bar near the back wall. He had not been scheduled to attend this particular event. He'd been booked for a late show in the main room. Finished 20 minutes early the way he sometimes did when the room was good, and he'd found a pace that worked and decided not to push past it, and wandered into the side entrance because he'd heard the music filtering to the wall and recognized it the way you recognize the voice of someone you love in a crowded room. Not by analysis, not by conscious identification, but by the way your body responds before your mind catches up. He was still in his performance tuxedo, the jacket slightly loosened, the bow tie impeccably knotted because Dean Martin bow ties were always impeccably knotted, a fact his valet had confirmed was achieved entirely without effort and entirely without mirrors, which was a kind of detail that annoyed people who work hard at things. He was holding a glass of something amber that he occasionally lifted and occasionally set back down without drinking from. The glass serving in that moment more as an object for his hands than a beverage for his body. He wore the loose, easy expression that the public had spent a decade mistaking for laziness, for the comfortable disengagement of a man who had gotten what he wanted from life and was now simply enjoying the residuals. People who knew him, really knew him, the people who had worked alongside him and watched him when he didn't know he was being watched, recognized it as something else entirely, a profound, watchful stillness that he deployed with the same quiet intentionality with which a hunter deploys patience. Dean Martin missed nothing. He had simply learned to look like a man who missed everything. He leaned against the bar and he listened, and listening was, for Dean Martin, a physical act. You could see it in the slight forward tilt of the head, the quality of stillness that was not relaxation, but attention. He was not looking at Caruso. Not yet. The trouble started, as trouble in those rooms almost always did, with a request that wasn't really a request. Ella was between songs, inhabiting that small, charged pause she used to let the previous note finish living the room before she introduced anything new into the air. When the waiter appeared at the edge of the performance area, he was a young man, 23 or 24, and the discomfort on his face was a very specific discomfort of someone caught between two forces they cannot measure against each other. He crossed to Ella with the reluctant purposefulness of a man, walking towards something he'd been told he had to do and wished he didn't. He leaned in. He whispered something close to her ear. Her expression did not change visibly. A musician watching very closely, someone trained in the micro-expressions of performers. Maya caught the faint tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible compression of the jaw. She held it for 1 second, 2, then she nodded once. And the waiter retreated with the speed of a man who has delivered a message and wants no part of whatever comes next. She sang one more song, How High the Moon, which she delivered with a casual, shattering perfection of someone doing something they could do in their sleep, but choosing instead to do it wide awake and at full force, her voice moving to the chord changes with freedom that made the changes themselves seem like suggestions rather than requirements. The room was leveled by it. People who had been in mid-conversation stopped. People who had been watching politely found themselves watching with something considerably less polite and considerably more honest. The song ended on a note that hung in the air for 3 full seconds after she stopped producing it, living in the room on its own momentum. Then she paused. "I've been asked," she said to the room, in that voice that was warm and precise and carried no apology in it anywhere, "to change my program for the second half of the evening." A murmur moved through the room. Polite, curious, with respect, Ella said, her eyes moving across the assembled faces with the even, unhurried gaze of a woman making something clear. "I'm going to decline that." The murmur shifted, not dramatically, the way a current shifts underwater, invisible from the surface but felt by anyone in it. At table 3, Raymond Caruso's hands moved on the tablecloth, just slightly, the way a tide moves before it becomes a wave. His face remained still, but his hands moved, and Sal, who had spent 3 years reading those hands away sailors' red weather, went very quiet and put his own glass down. The request had been Caruso's. His people had sent it through the waiter. A request, framed as a preference, delivered with the expectation compliance that had governed every preference Raymond Caruso had expressed for the last 20 years. He had wanted something different for the second half of the evening, something lighter, something that he felt, with the authority of a man who does not examine his own aesthetic opinions, suited the particular mood of a late dinner better than what she was programming. He had not framed this as a request in any meaningful sense of the word. He had framed it the way men who have not heard no in a very long time frame things, as information about how the next hour was going to proceed. Ella Fitzgerald had received this information and decided it was incorrect. She continued her program. She sang magnificently. The room, for the most part, was grateful. The room, for the most part, had forgotten in the presence of the music that there was anything else to think about. Caruso was not the room, for the most part. When she finished, when the applause had risen and crested and she had stepped back from the microphone with the composed dignity of someone who has done exactly what they intended to do and is entirely at peace with the result, Caruso stood up from table 3. He did not stand up the way angry men stand up, with the sudden verticality of uncontrolled feeling. He stood up the way he did everything, with a deliberate, weighted movement of a man who has decided something and is now implementing the decision. He straightened his jacket. He moved away from table 3, without looking at Sal, without acknowledging the 2 men from the commission, without any of the small social signals that normally accompany departure from a table. He walked between the occupied tables at the pace of a man crossing his own property, and the people whose chairs he passed moved those chairs slightly, without quite understanding why they were moving them. Ella was thanking the string quartet when he arrived at the edge of the performance area. He said her name. She turned. What he said to her in the 90 seconds that followed, in a voice calibrated to carry to the nearest tables, but not beyond, was later reconstructed from the memories of 7 people who were close enough to hear fragments, and the reconstructions converged on a shape, if not on precise language. He told her she had embarrassed him. He told her she had been asked something simple and reasonable. He told her she did not understand how certain things worked in certain rooms. He told her she should have been more careful about who she was dealing with. He said all of this with a flat, informational tone of a man who was not making an argument but delivering a verdict, and the delivery carried in it the assumption, the deep, structural, 30-year assumption, that the delivery would be sufficient, that the verdict would be accepted, that the woman in front of him would do what every other person in his world did when Raymond Caruso spoke to them in that tone, which was to absorb the message and adjust her behavior accordingly. Ella Fitzgerald looked at him the way she looked at everything. Directly, without the slightest deviation or flinch, with the specific, particular composure of a woman who had been told, in terms both polite and explicit, from the time she was old enough to understand what was being said, by an entire civilization that had organized significant portions of its energy around a project of her diminishment, that she did not belong in the rooms she kept walking into anyway. She had walked into those rooms anyway. She had walked into every single one of them, and she had learned, in the walking, that the only currency that mattered was the one you refused to spend on other people's definitions of your worth. She said something back to him, brief, clear, delivered with the same precision she gave to music. Whatever it was, Raymond Caruso's face changed. The stillness that had governed his expression all evening broke, not into rage, which would have been readable and therefore manageable, but into something colder, something that had been waiting underneath the stillness the entire time, patient and temperatureless, like water under ice. And then his hand came up. It was not a punch. It was the back of his hand. A gesture almost casual in its execution, a gesture that communicated with its casualness something more precise and more devastating than a punch would have, which was a statement. You are beneath the level of effort that a closed fist would represent. It caught her across the left cheek with a sound that cut through the ambient noise of 230 people at dinner, like a blade through fabric, sharp and clean and absolutely unambiguous. The room did not gasp. It went silent. There is a difference. A gasp is a reaction. Silence, in that moment, was a temporary failure of the entire room to produce a response commensurate with what had just occurred. 230 people simultaneously experienced the same event and simultaneously ran out of the language for it. Ella did not fall. She took one step back, involuntary, the body's honest response to impact, and her right hand went to her left cheek with a reflex of someone who had been hurt and then, in the next half second, visibly, deliberately, brought that hand down. Her chin came up. Her spine, which had been straight before, found some additional resource of straightness. Her eyes found Raymond Caruso's face and did not leave it. Did not leave it. The gaze of a woman who has decided that whatever happens next, she will not look away first. The silence lasted 4 seconds. On the 4th second, a glass hit the floor at the bar near the back wall. Dean Martin did not run across the room. That is the crucial fact. The fact that distinguished what happened from what people imagined later when they heard versions of it. He did not move with urgency. He did not arrive with the heat of reaction still on him. He set his glass down on the bar with the careful placement of a man who intends to pick it up again later. He straightened his jacket. He handed his cigarette to the bartender with the calm of a man, leaving something somewhere safe while he attends briefly to something that requires his hands to be free. Then he walked at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, but purposeful in a way that was different from speed. Purposeful in a way that things with mass and intention are purposeful, through the room between the tables, and people move for him without quite understanding why. He reached the performance area and stopped 3 feet from Raymond Caruso. The space between them was not empty. It was full of everything that was about to be said, and everything that the room was holding its breath against. And both men stood in it for a moment that lasted longer than it lasted, measuring. "Ray," Dean said. One word. The familiarity of it. The use of the shortened name. The name used by people who knew him. Deployed here not as warmth, but as the opposite of warmth. As the shorthand of someone who had taken full inventory of who you were and was now cashing in that knowledge. Landed in the room like something placed rather than thrown. "Martin." Caruso's voice was flat. "I need you to look at what you just did." "I know what I just did." "I don't think you do." There was nothing in Dean's voice that resembled the Dean Martin the room knew. No warmth, no ease, no the performance of likability that was his most famous characteristic. What was there instead was something older and quieter and considerably more serious. The voice of a man who grew up in Steubenville, Ohio, with a name that wasn't Dean Martin, and a father who was a barber, and a neighborhood that didn't produce people who were gentle about things that mattered. Because if you actually knew what you just did, you wouldn't be standing there like you just did something ordinary. Like what? Like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. Caruso's head tilted. It was a head tilt of a man running calculations. He had known Dean Martin for 6 years, in the social way that powerful men in Las Vegas knew entertainers, as ornaments, as facilitators of atmosphere, as useful men who made rooms feel like rooms worth being in. He had considered Dean Martin, without malice and without much thought, the way powerful men in that world considered most entertainers. Fundamentally decorative, talented, valuable in their way, not, in any serious sense, a force to be reckoned with in the real world, which was to say the world of consequences and leverage and the kind of power that didn't dissolve when the house lights came up. He was reconsidering now. Something in Dean's stillness, the quality of it, the temperature of it, was making him reconsider. "This doesn't concern you," Caruso said. "You put your hand on Ella Fitzgerald. That's between." There's no between. The phrase was quiet, and it was final. And it stopped Caruso the way a wall stops a car, not with force, but with the simple physical fact of being there and not moving. There is no version of this story where you put your hand on her and it becomes a private matter. There is no version of this evening where you walk out of this room without having answered for what you just did. I want you to understand that as clearly as you've ever understood anything. Caruso looked at him for a long moment. "You want to be careful, Dean." "I'm very careful," Dean said. "I've been careful my whole life. I was careful in ways that people around me couldn't afford to be. And it kept me in rooms that otherwise would have been closed to me. And I understand exactly what I'm risking right now by standing here. I'm telling you that I've done the math, and I'm standing here anyway, which should tell you something about what I think this is worth." A pause in which the room breathed very carefully. "She sang for these people tonight," Dean continued, his voice still quiet, still absent of anything that resembled performance or display. "She sang better than most of them deserved, and she gave it everything she had, and she did it with a professionalism that you will never be capable of understanding, because you have never once in your life had to be professional. You have only had to be powerful, which is completely different. And then you walked over here and you put your hand on her face because she declined to rearrange her concert to suit your mood. I want you to think about what that actually is, not what it is in your world, what it actually is in the world." Something moved through Caruso's face that was not quite shame. Shame required quality of self-awareness that 30 years of uncontested power had not left much room for, but was its precursor. The faint, uncomfortable recognition that he was being seen clearly by someone who was not afraid of him, and that the scene was accurate. "Ray." Dean's voice dropped another register, went from quiet to something below quiet. "I know people in this room. Not the way you know people. I know them differently. I know them from a direction you haven't thought about. And some of the people I know are people you need. And you know that's true. And you know I'm not saying it to threaten you. I'm saying it so you understand that the calculation here is not what you think it is. A beat. There is one way this evening ends where you lose as little as possible. You know what that way is." So I drifted 3 steps back. The movement was involuntary, and it was visible to everyone within 20 feet, and in the specific language of that room. In the vocabulary of men who understood the semiotics of proximity to power, it was a statement of enormous consequence. It said, "I am no longer certain which side of this has the more dangerous position." Caruso registered it. His eyes moved to Sal and then to the men from the commission, both of whom had discovered urgent interest in the middle distance approximately 30 feet to the left of the performance area. He looked at the room, at 230 faces that had been watching everything with the composed, careful attention of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be told and retold, and whose accounts would be checked against each other for the rest of their lives. He looked at Ella Fitzgerald. She had not moved. She had not softened. She stood beside the microphone with both hands at her sides and her head level, and her gaze carrying the accumulated weight of every room that had tried to tell her she was less than she was, and the accumulated weight of every time she had refused that verdict without raising her voice, without argument, simply by continuing to be exactly what she was in the face of everything that insisted she be less. He looked at Dean Martin. The look that passed between them in that final moment contained, on Caruso's side, the full complexity of man arriving at a conclusion he had not anticipated and did not enjoy, that he was in a room in which a particular kind of power was not, tonight, the decisive kind, that he had made an error, not a moral error. He did not frame it to himself in moral terms, but a strategic one. He had struck someone in a room that had decided, silently, collectively, without discussion, that the striking was unacceptable, and the person standing 3 feet in front of him, in a tuxedo with a loosened jacket, was the room's elected representative for this verdict. Raymond Caruso turned to Ella Fitzgerald. He did not look at his shoes. He was not a man who looked at his shoes. He owned his actions, always had, because ownership of your actions, even the ones you regretted, was the only form of integrity available in the life he had built, and he had held to it the way a man holds to the one piece of furniture that hasn't floated away in a flood. "Miss Fitzgerald," he said. His voice was level, carrying, audible to the 8 nearest tables, and therefore, given the silence of the room, audible beyond them. "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong." He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a man paying a price he had not budgeted for. "I'm sorry." The room exhaled. Not applause. Applause would have been too small and too social response for what had just happened. What the room produced was something more organic than applause. The collective exhalation of 230 people releasing breath they had been holding without knowing it. A sound like a building that has taken a stress and survived it, settling back into itself. Ella looked at him for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, her face did the work of containing everything. The pain of the struck cheek, the 40 years of being struck by a civilization that operated exactly like this man at a structural level, the fury that she had learned to alchemize into something that didn't destroy the vessel it lived in, the complicated and involuntary grace of a person who'd been formed by difficulty into someone capable of receiving an apology from a man like this without making him smaller than he had already made himself. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, delivered with the full weight of someone who means exactly what they say and nothing more and nothing less. Caruso nodded. He turned. He walked back to table 3 at the same pace he had walked away from it. Neither faster nor slower. The walk of a man who had paid something and was now simply carrying the fact of having paid it. Sal fell in beside him without a word. The men from the commission busied themselves with their wine glasses as he passed. Dean turned to Ella. Something in his face had shifted from what it had been during the confrontation. The severity was receding, replaced by something warmer and more personal. The face of a man returning from a task to himself. "You should finish your set," he said. She looked at him, that measuring look, and then something in it, a small, genuine warmth, a thing that had been earned rather than offered. "I had 2 more songs." "2 more songs," he said. And then, because he was Dean Martin and the moment had earned something real, and because real things do not require ornamentation, they should hear them, he started back toward the bar. She caught his arm. Lightly, briefly, the touch of a person making contact with someone they want to stop for just a moment, just one moment, before the world starts moving again. "Dean," she said. He stopped and turned. "Thank you." He looked at her. He did not say don't mention it. He did not deflect it. Did not send it back to her smaller than she had given it. Did not process the moment through the machinery of charm that was his professional instrument. He simply received it. The 2 words, the look, the full weight of what they meant from this woman in this room on this night. And he let it register, and he nodded, not the performance of a nod, the thing itself. Then he went back to the bar. The bartender held out his cigarette, without being asked. Dean took it and leaned against the wall and watched. Ella Fitzgerald returned to the microphone. She stood at it for 1 moment before she began, a moment so brief most of the room missed it, but in which something was decided or acknowledged or simply felt. And then she sang. The first of the 2 remaining songs moved through the room with all the force and precision of everything she had delivered before the interruption. And when it was over to silence before the applause was slightly longer than it had been earlier, the room needing that extra half second to return from wherever the music had taken it. The second song, Misty, which was not on the program, which she introduced simply by beginning it without announcement, she sang differently from everything that had come before. Not better, because better implied that what had come before was anything less than extraordinary, which it wasn't. Different in a way that something becomes different when it comes from a new place inside the person producing it. More interior, more unguarded, like a room in a house that is usually kept closed, open briefly so that the air can move through it. She sang it directly to no one and therefore everyone, and the room accepted it the way rooms accept the best things that happen in them, in total, grateful, uncomplicated silence. When the last note ended, the silence lasted for 5 seconds. Then someone at table 11 stood up, then someone at table 4, then table 7, table 2, Table 15, and then it was 230 people on their feet in the Venetian Ballroom, while the chandeliers threw candlelight across everything, a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which the entertainment director of the Sands would later note in his records as the longest in the hotel's history to that point. Dean Martin stood at the bar and applauded with the rest of them. None of it was reported the next morning. Not in the Sun, not in the Review Journal, not in any of the entertainment columns that cover the Sands with the devoted attention of people whose livelihoods ran on proximity to what happened inside it. This was a particular silence of Las Vegas in 1958, a silence maintained by the interlocking interests of men who owned the press and men who owned the properties and men who owned, in various quiet and deniable ways, each other. The silence was not conspiratorial in the formal sense. It required no meeting, no agreement, no explicit instruction. It was the silence of a system that understood its own requirements and met them automatically. Raymond Caruso left the Sands at night before 11 o'clock and did not return for 26 months. He and Dean Martin were never again in the same room, by arrangement or avoidance. No one who knew ever specified which. His name appears in no account of that evening. He died in 1971 of a heart attack in his office on Fremont Street, at his desk alone. Ella Fitzgerald performed at the Sands 7 more times between 1959 and 1972. On each of those visits, without explanation or attribution, her dressing room contained a single arrangement of white gardenias. The hotel's florist had no record of the orders. The entertainment director had no record of the authorization. Nobody who might have known said anything. Dean Martin never addressed the evening publicly in 4 decades of interviews, and there were many, because he was the kind of figure that journalists and documentarians and retrospective journalists kept finding worth revisiting. He deflected every approach to the subject with the impenetrable warmth that was his greatest public instrument. There's one exception, documented by a journalist from Rolling Stone who had reconstructed a partial account of the evening from 3 surviving witnesses and raised it near the end of a long conversation in 1987, when Dean was 70 years old and had the look of a man who had made his peace with most things and was waiting pleasantly for the rest. There was a pause after the question, long enough to be deliberate. Then Dean said, "She was the best there was." Don't put your hand on the best there was and walk away from it like it was nothing. That's just math. The journalist asked whether he had been afraid. Dean smiled, not the performance smile, the one calibrated for photographs and television. The real one, the one that appeared rarely and changed his whole face when it did, that reached all the way to the eyes and stayed there. Afraid she'd stop singing, he said. That was the only thing I was afraid of. She didn't stop. She sang for 35 more years in rooms all over the world, in front of every kind of audience, at every kind of occasion. And she was, at the end of those 35 years, exactly what she had been at the beginning. The best there was. She died in 1996. The tributes that followed her death came from every direction and every register of admiration, from other musicians and from heads of state, and from people who had never met her and had experienced her only through recordings. And they all said different things, but they all said the same thing, which was that she had given the world something it did not deserve, and had given it freely and without condition, and had kept on giving it long past the point where the world had given her sufficient reason to stop. In every room she walked into for 35 years after that December evening in 1958, she walked like a woman who knew, not as belief, not as hope, but as a cellular, bone-level knowledge of lived experience, that there's at least one person in the world who had chosen, when it cost someone to choose, to stand next to her. That knowledge does something to a person. It does something specific and irreplaceable to a voice, to the place a voice comes from, to the depth at which a voice can reach into the people listening. Everyone who ever heard her sing in those 35 years heard it. Even if they couldn't name it, it was in there, unmistakably, in every note. The man who raised his hand is a footnote in a story that doesn't need him. The woman who stood back up is a legend. And the man who walked across the room and stood beside her, he just called it math. But the people who were in that ballroom, the ones who lived long enough to be asked about it, every single one of them said the same thing when they tried to describe what they had witnessed. They said it felt like watching someone decide what they were made of, and then watching them be exactly that.